better to define if you can define the limits of the insertion, it would help you in planning your surgery. So earlier what was done, you had A and B scan ultrasound, which are used for thyroid abnormalities, CT scan, MRI, all these, the patient really has to go through a tedious process. I mean, when you have to get an MRI for the muscles. But even though all these things have been there in the past, but none of these techniques has been able to define the precise insertion of the muscles to the globe and the distance of the insertion from the limbus. That is so important. Now you have newer tools like OCT as well. UBM has been in vogue since quite some time. And because they have improved penetration and resolution, it's an OPD procedure. I mean, it's such a convenient thing to do if you have one for your surgical planning. ASOCT, yes, obviously it's something new in the armamentarium, so you would require more validation, more studies, and of course, Dr. Savleen is really into it and publishing. So we are getting more on these things and how helpful these tools are going to be. So UBM has been shown to be a useful tool for your location of extraocular muscle. Whatever few studies have been done, it has helped in better planning and for the surgery. So it could be like, it's basically a 35 to 50 megahertz probe. We have a 10 megahertz probe as well. It has excellent tissue differentiation, resolution of 0.1 millimeter, and a good penetrance. It provides a magnified image of the anterior segment, which is real time, in a non-invasive manner. So distance, the most important thing is the distance of the extraocular muscle from the limbus, what we are interested in. So because that's going to decide whether we would be operating on this muscle or whether we need to touch the other eye. And what has been done for the muscles. Why has the patient developed a squint? Has the muscle migrated? Has it slipped? Is there a pseudotendon formation? That is the most important thing what a UBM tells. But yes, it could also tell the status of the scoroid and the sclera beneath the suture site. So why is all this needed? Why do we need to do UBM? We can just go ahead and plan a surgery and on our clinical evaluation. Well, when you have imaging, why not? I mean, it would definitely give you a better guidance in what you're going to do, because during surgery, excessive manipulation of the tissues, when it is based on an assumed location, can affect the surgical access. There is more conjunctival scarring, more bleeding when you're just assuming that where the muscles are. So do a UBM. So as I told you, it has a 10 megahertz scanner. Obviously, the 50 megahertz has a better resolution, 10 times higher. The quality is much better. The field is wider. So how it is done is basically it has a probe, which I'll be showing you in my next slide. A transducer probe held, and accessories such as an eye cup, which were used previously, or a clear scan tips, which are now available. And scanning is performed when the patient in the supine position. So it cannot be performed in the sitting position, and it's done under topical anesthesia in the outpatient clinic. So these are the two ways it could be done. The earlier way how it was done was like you can say like an immersion scan. You have a cup here, you fill up fluid, and you have the probe going inside. But now you have a clear scan technique where you have a sleeve which goes onto the probe, and you have fluid in that. And I mean, you have a wider view. It's more comfortable for the patient. So the advantages of this clear scan technique is it's sterile, it's safe, it's comfortable, and it's quick. So this extends the clinical research of UBM because ocular structures which are 10 millimeters peripheral to the limbus now can be visualized without a fear of causing any corneal injury. And this is FDA approved. So this is how it's done. It's a very simple thing. You hold the probe tangentially over the muscle and move it to and fro over the limbus with the oscillation perpendicular to the limbus. So it's fairly a simple procedure without you're not going onto the cornea, so no chances of any corneal injury. If you want to scan the medial rectus, you could adduct the eye, or if you want to abduct the eye, or if you want to scan the lateral rectus, probably then you need to adduct the eye. So you can get a better view of the muscle. So how do we see these muscles? You have done a UBM. Of course, this is important now. This comes with experience. Look what to look for. How do the muscles look like? Whether it's a true muscle or whether you're having some other kind of a morphology of the muscles, some kind of a pseudotendon or a scar. So this would come with experience. So just to show you what it does is, this is a sulcus to sulcus scan. So depending upon depicting the opposite angles. So from these angles now, we need to go back till we are able to see the muscle belly. Now this muscle belly, this appears as a hyporeflective area starting from this and going posteriorly. So the limits are there. How posteriorly can you go is the limitation, but it does help you in planning, and which I will be coming later to in my talk and telling you how it would help even if you're not able to see it. So just to give you a little real-time scenario where you can see what happens is, this is the UBM. So this is the area where we go. That's the area between the stroma and the sclera. So it's hyporeflective and a reflective sclera. So once you go posteriorly, and then you start seeing a shadow, a hyporeflective area. This is a linear shadow. Now this is what the muscle insertion is, from where the muscle would be starting. Now just to, without those markings, you're going posteriorly from the limbus, from the angle, and now you can see the black shadow. So this is where the muscle insertion is. That's how you delineate on the UBM where the actual muscle insertion is. So it's a distance which is measured from the limbus with an inbuilt caliper. So from the starting of the shadow, which is this pointer here, up to the limbus would give you the insertion where you can add a millimeter to it, because they say that it's the angle is really, it's the posterior by 1 millimeter to the limbus. So that's again a recessed lateral rectus muscle, and you measure the chord length from the limbus to the insertion of the muscle. Now this is the insertion of the muscle, and this is your so-called limbus. Now this is a resected muscle. It's a magnified view. You can see how thick it is, but yes, it starts off from somewhere here, and then you can easily measure the distance. So when you have a pseudo tendon, now those, if you saw those shadows, there was really good, nice shadows which are going posteriorly. But sometimes what happens is you have a faint shadow here. So this faint shadow is not really continuous posteriorly somewhere. So it could be a pseudo tendon or maybe some kind of a scar. So this is also something which, with experience, one would come to know what is, you could identify the cause of maybe an ESO or EXO after doing a surgery years later when you have such type of an appearance. So yes, this is not easy. It's not easy to identify in the first go. You would need to see many UBMs. You would need to do UBMs to be able to delineate what this looks like. So in the magnified view again, if you see, that's the view, this small area here. So that's like a pseudo tendon. So the limits of detection with the 50 Hertz probe, medial rectus is like now 13, lateral rectus is 15 with the studies coming on, and in vertical recti about 12 millimeters from the limbus. So that is how posterior you can go from the limbus to identify a muscle, not beyond that. So this is one of the study which was done at a center. This was a thesis where we studied the UBM insertions in horizontal recti muscles after their surgery. And so these were patients who are undergoing primary horizontal muscle surgery, but yes, because it's slightly older study, so you use the 10 Hertz probe. We could identify medial rectus muscles in all cases, and 14 out of 16 lateral rectus muscles. Fairly accurate measurements. They were plus minus 1 millimeter within the intraoperative measurements with the surgical calipers as well. So it was fairly accurate. So we had 14 medial rectus muscles where we recessed 5, resected 9. We had 16 lateral rectus. So the medial rectus were recessed much lesser as compared to the lateral rectus. So that's why probably the UBM could identify medial rectus in 100%, whereas in lateral rectus, probably just in 8 cases, 3 recessions, and the maximum limit was 11.2 and 13.8 for the lateral rectus and 11.2 for the medial rectus. So we could not go beyond that. If the lateral rectus was beyond 14 millimeters from the limbus, probably we were unable to identify. So the second place where it's been useful is plications. Now, resections, there have been reports and studies, but plications probably, yes, how they behave and how useful the UBM is has not been studied so extensively. So this was just where we compare the efficacy of resection of horizontal recti with plication in treatment of exotropia with did UBM measurements. The
time is up, please continue.
Fairly accurate in
Can you just please switch off the timer? It's okay. We'll have enough time. We'll just take 1 or 2 more minutes.
Okay, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you.
So basically, the results are fairly comparable in both of them, and we could identify the muscles on the UBM as well. You can see here the plication. What is happening is it's a double shadow. So that's the difference between resection. So you have one shadow above, one shadow below. So if you want to know how much is the plication done, it's like if you double up the measurements, that's it. So it's twice the length of the double shadow. So that's the amount of the plication. So it's fairly useful here as well. In when your patient has had plications and you want to know basically how much it has been done and what has gone wrong if what after a certain period of time like this patient here. So you can see here the shadow above is receded as compared to the shadow below. So this is a plicated muscle. Now, is it a slippage of suture or is it a receding effect of the muscle plication? Yes, you can study this. Although you can correlate with the clinical outcome also, but yes, in this patient, probably we did not have any kind of over or an under correction happening even with this amount of slippage. So, I mean, it does give you some kind of imaging of the muscle, that what is happening, is it correlating to your clinical picture or not, and it can help us further in further studies as well. So the shortcomings are that there's a limit of detection because of obstruction of the probe, the nasal probe. When you're going medially, it's the nose. And yes, the limits are probably more than 7 to 8 millimeters of the limbus. Probably it's difficult to image the muscle. So I would conclude here by saying that it's a non-invasive modality. It provides high resolution area, fairly accurate up till a limit. But yes, that limit is also very important. If you're not able to image a muscle till that limit, at least you know it is beyond a certain distance from the limbus, and that could be 14 millimeters, what we were able to calculate. So even when you're visualizing, it's good. Even though you're not visualizing, still it would give you an idea. Thank you so much. Yes. Stop sharing. How do you stop sharing? Now I would like to invite Dr. Savleen for her presentations. Of course, she has now a lot of experience in imaging. That's her interest, and she's published it widely. She's presented it, and probably now is starting to come on that expert platform for imaging. So I'll invite Dr. Savleen for our talk on ASOCT in strabismus.
Thank you, sir. That was an excellent overview on UBM, because it was actually the first technology that we used to actually precisely see the muscle insertions. But because technologies keep changing, and now we have the newer tool, that is the anterior segment OCT. So I would like to begin by what Dr. Jaspreet concluded with the UBM, like the shortcomings of UBM, whether the ASOCT can actually overcome them. Now, the anterior segment OCT in strabismus is primarily the same has been used in the same way as the UBM. The surgical dosage calculations, when we assume a location of an extraocular muscle from the limbus, we have the risk of intraoperative complications and bleeding, which becomes very important in cases where reoperations are being done, and we do not have any information on previous surgery. Sometimes we have an information, we are the operating surgeon and we are redoing the same patients, but after a long time. So we do expect to see muscle creeps, muscle scars, migration of the muscles, which we will only discover on table if we do not have tools like the UBM and the ASOCT. Now, just sharing a case of a 25-year male who had a best corrected visual acuity of 6.6 and 6.12, presented with a left exotropia of 30 prism diopter. He had a history of squint surgery, but did not have any records as to what surgery was done and which eye was operated upon. Now, in thus situations like this, we see the extraocular motility, which is almost equal in both eyes. We do see some scarring on the left eye. There is some redness over the lateral rectus insertion in the right eye, but we are not sure whether which eye was operated, and we do not know at all that what was the measurement at the time of the first surgery. So what would you do next? How much surgery would you do considering your surgical dosages assume the location of extraocular muscles to be normal? We, of course, are talking about imaging now, and if you have the tool, why not image? Imaging can give you a precise measurement of the muscle insertion distance, but in resurgeries, it might be difficult. The MRI and CT scans are not very accurate, and we have now established from the last talk that we have the ultrasound biomicroscope, which can accurately tell us up to 1 mm where the muscle insertion can be. Even if we do not know where the muscle is, we know at least at a specific distance at which we might be able to see the muscle on table. UBM has some disadvantages, as Dr. Jasprit concluded, that when we are dealing with reoperations or we are looking at patients who have undergone larger recessions, we might not be able to use UBM very accurately. And the biggest disadvantage being not being able to use it in uncooperative patients and children, especially when you want to image larger distances, they will not adduct and abduct. And it's a contact method, you might not be able to do it in the outpatient department. This is where the role of ASOCT comes into picture. One of our earliest papers on ASOCT, and of course the literature has now established that it's a less invasive technique and it's quicker to image muscle insertion distances in primary surgeries. We have a paper under publication in JAPOS, which reports a good accuracy in resurgeries to the extent of 70% by the ASOCT. Of course, it has advantages, being quicker, being non-contact, and be able to measure larger distances. Now, how do we do in ASOCT? We have seen how UBM works. We can do it in the outpatient department. For the ASOCT, is actually a convenient method, more convenient than the UBM. If you see, you make the patient sit on just like a slit lamp. It's a non-contact method. This patient has previously undergone a squint surgery. So on the left side of the screen, you can see the patient data, and the right side of the screen telling you what all previous scans have been done. Now the ASOCT is primarily for the lens and for the cornea. So you have to choose a different protocol while you are trying to look at the muscle. You can choose the cataract protocol or an anterior segment or even the BLEB protocol if you want to look at the superior rectus and inferior rectus. Once you have chosen the protocol, you try to image the muscle by asking the patient to look in the opposite direction. You could do it on a raster mode. You have global scans as well, which go beyond 14 mm from the limbus. You have to switch to sometimes a manual screening because automatically it will just focus on the lens. So manually, you try to locate where the extraocular muscle insertion distance can be. When you have quite a lot of scarring, you see here the technician will try to lift the lid because we want a particular section and area of the muscle to be imaged. And once you have localized the muscle, you try to bring the angle as well as the muscle in the same frame. The acquisition is quite quick. This is an unedited video, so it just takes about, say, 3 to 4 seconds. And you can actually scan the whole breadth of the muscle and see if you have got a good scan. And then again, you save it for your future references and you ask the patient to look in the opposite direction to image the corresponding muscle, the lateral rectus in this instance. So you can take measurements from the angle as well as from the limbus, the same way that you did on the UBM. So this is how a recessed medial rectus looks on the ASOCT vis-a-vis the same muscle of the same patient on the UBM. Again, a resected lateral rectus on the ASOCT vis-a-vis on the UBM. You can see how clearly we can define the cleft between the muscle insertion and the sclera. So it makes the identification of the muscle insertion quite simple and easy. In cases where you have reoperations, for example, this one has a little bit of scarring superficially onto the muscle, but you can still see the muscle clearly. In the UBM, again, it is seen clearly, but the pseudotendon over it or the scarring is not very clear in the UBM. In larger distances, say this one is 13 mm from the angle, so maybe around 14 mm from the limbus, you sometimes do not localize the muscle on the UBM because the patient will not be able to adduct that much with the probe. And of course, the patient, if it is uncooperative because the patient, you are touching the patient, of course. Now, if you ask me which ASOCT to use, you can use any. Of course, it is Spectralis is available. Any anterior segment practice will have an ASOCT, I think, available in a tertiary institute and sometimes in good private institutes as well. The Spectralis gives a good resolution, but the distances measured might not be that far off from the limbus, and acquisition time is a little more than the swept source OCT, which to my opinion is the best in the market right now. Comparing ASOCT versus UBM, do I replace the UBM now? If in the practice, we try to see in our center, we did a study comparing the UBM and the ASOCT in resurgeries alone. Of course, in primary surgeries, you might not want to image. In this paper, which is again under publication in JAPOS, we recruited patients aged 6 to 60 years who had a history of previous surgery, and we delineated the muscle insertion distances on the ASOCT as well as the UBM, and also compared them to the caliper measurement at the time of surgery. We saw that amongst the 13 operated muscles which had all types of diagnosis of residual and consecutive exo and esotropias, the patients were emetropic. We saw that ASOCT and UBM were comparable to the caliper. It was not statistically different. But once you talk about muscle insertions within 1 mm, the ASOCT gave an accuracy of 70% as compared to, fairly low on the UBM. If you exclude the cases that you could not image, this comes down to 40%. There was an excellent agreement between ASOCT with caliper, and UBM also gave a good correlation with the caliper. The maximum distance on the ASOCT was 14 mm and 10.4 on the UBM, which is right now the UBM that we used is a wide field UBM. The average score of comfort on the ASOCT was also higher, and it obviously took lesser time to image the muscle on the ASOCT vis-a-vis on the UBM. Pseudotendon recognition was also very, very convenient and much higher resolution on the ASOCT. You see this picture, this is a pseudotendon in a patient who had an exotropia. We saw intraop also that this was where the original medial rectus was, and this patient had a recessed medial rectus, and this was the scar that we could pick up on the ASOCT. On the UBM, you can see some hypoechoicities, but you're not sure whether this is muscle or the pseudotendon. So we advance the medial rectus and we get a fairly good outcome in the patient while operating on the same eye and on the same muscles. So ASOCT also has different color modes. Sometimes you might not see it on the black and white mode, and you can see it on the color mode very accurately. Of course, ASOCT was graded as more comfortable to the patient in our studies, and in larger recessions also, the UBM was suboptimal. Every machine has its limitations. Of course, you need a trained staff, you have a learning curve, and so does the ASOCT. Patients might have some conditions which preclude a good ASOCT, like nystagmus and motility disorders, and you might not be able to move the eye in a particular direction to image the opposite muscle. So in that case, it is difficult. You have patients like buckle. So it's an optical method, so you will not be able to see the muscle very nicely if you have something lying over the muscle, like in this case, where there's a buckle over the muscle. Nevertheless, in small children, you have to resort to general anesthesia, and there maybe you can do the UBM in the operating room because you cannot carry the ASOCT machine. So barring that, by and large, ASOCT has replaced UBM for a lot of conditions in strabismus. To conclude, of course, no technology is perfect. For the ASOCT, I would like to quote that you decide guiding your ASOCT measurements, but always take a decision on the OR table while dealing with a patient with strabismus. Thank you very much. With that, I will not waste much time. We can take discussion and questions in the end. And I would like to invite Dr. Shweta for her talk on neuroimaging in strabismus, when, why, and which one to order. Dr. Shweta, all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Savleen, for the kind invitation. So strabismus can be a symptom of diverse disorders, and decision of neuroimaging can play a pivotal role in reaching out to the correct diagnosis and formulating a correct treatment, tailored treatment plan. And here we will discuss when, why, and which imaging has to be ordered. So there are suspicious symptoms that warrant further imaging in strabismus. And this,
Shweta, you have to share your screen. We cannot see your slides.
I have shared. Is it shared?
No, it's not yet shared. Yeah, now we can see your slides. Thank you.
Okay. So there could be suspicious symptoms like headache, sudden onset strabismus, unexplained visual loss, diplopia, loss of visual field, any neurological sign, eye pain, trauma. Then there could be suspicious sign which could warrant further imaging in strabismus, like decreased visual acuity, afferent pupillary defect, any anisocoria, light-near dissociation, visual field defect, papilledema, optic atrophy, nystagmus, cranial nerve palsy, any neurological signs, variability, and recurrence. So when do you order CT? Generally, CT is ordered to see intraosseous segment of cranial nerves and skull base foramina. It helps also in evaluation of fractures, muscle entrapment, presence of orbital mass, subarachnoid hemorrhage, calcification in aneurysms. Then CT angiography is equal to digital subtraction angiography in detecting intracranial aneurysms. Now, when do you order MRI? It should be ordered when intracranial pathologies are suspected in strabismus. It's a gold standard for studying cranial nerves, and the best sequences of cistern segment of cranial nerves is seen on steady state free processing images. Then MRI is also helpful in detecting the vascular flow patterns, delineating inflammation, demyelination, ischemic infarction, abscess, infiltration, tumor. And diffusion weighted images can demonstrate small and acute infarct, and MRI orbit can reveal lesions associated with extraocular muscles. So I will be discussing different case scenarios to start with cranial mononeuropathy. So the indication for neuroimaging in cranial mononeuropathy is younger than 50 with an acute onset cranial nerve palsy, over 50 without any vasculopathic risk factors like diabetes, hypertension, but the history of any type of cancer, multiple cranial neuropathies, evidence of additional neurologic dysfunction, any pupillar involving palsy, and isolatal palsy that has progressed over a period of time. To begin with, a 52-year-old male presented with diplopia and ptosis with a sudden onset thunderclap headache with periorbital pain and loss of consciousness. On examination, he had right-sided third nerve palsy. Since the pupil was involved, so urgent MRI with MRA was ordered, and it revealed a saccular posterior communicating artery aneurysm, so which was impinging on the basilar part of third nerve. So the patient was referred to neurosurgery, and balloon-assisted coiling of the aneurysm was done, and the patient recovered. Now, case 2, a 62-year-old male presented with severe headache followed by slurring of speech associated with drooping of eyelid along with right-sided hemiplegia, which corroborated with the clinical finding of Weber syndrome. Imaging also corroborated the clinical findings where MRI showed infarct in the midbrain because of the occluded left vertebral artery. Unlike adults, all children presenting with third cranial palsy should undergo MRI regardless of pupillary involvement. Now consider this case. A 14-year-old boy presented with both high ptosis with adduction deficit with a 10 days history. So it was a case of bilateral nuclear third nerve, and the imaging was ordered. MRI brain revealed a contrast enhancing lesion in the midbrain, which was, and serum ELISA for neurocystic circus antigen was positive. So the patient was given a course of oral steroids and albendazole, to which he responded. Now, another example, a 12-year-old boy presented with a recurrent history of right third nerve palsy. On imaging, it showed right third nerve schwannoma. This the recurrent or waxing waning type was because of the cystic changes in the schwannoma, which was occurring over a period of time and resolved with steroid. Now, fourth nerve palsies with a subacute presentation and large fusional vertical amplitudes are likely long-standing congenital. They are often decompensated, presents with diplopia, and they do not require imaging. Unfortunately, isolated paralysis of trochlear nerve has no neurologic localizing value, and therefore visualization of complete course of nerves is often indicated, but only 4.3% of patients have lesions detected on MRI. So in a case of SOP, imaging is indicated in a case of trauma where hemorrhage could be detected on the imaging and the dorsal midbrain. Then microvascular lesions can also be seen on MRI. Tumors can also be rarely seen on MRI. Now coming to another case, 40-year-old male presented with inability to move left eye outward. He had history of headache since 4 weeks. Examination revealed a right-sided sixth nerve palsy. Imaging revealed a diffuse plaque-like thickening of left tentorium, and which was suggestive of granulomatous inflammatory changes consistent with the finding of hypertrophic pachymeningitis. which was impinging, which was causing basilar sixth nerve palsy. Further investigations revealed a high level of ACE. CCT chest revealed hilar lymphadenopathy, and its biopsy revealed non-caseating granuloma. So it was a sarcoid-related pachymeningitis. Now, it is also, neuroimaging is quite helpful in multiple cranial neuropathies. It helps you localize where is the lesion. Like a 34-year-old boy, patient presented with sudden onset redness and pain in one eye, decreased sensation over right side of face associated with proptosis. On examination, he had pulsatile exophthalmos, chemosis, dilated episcleral vessels, ophthalmoplegia involving pupil. Urgent MRI with angiography was done. MRI revealed enlarged superior ophthalmic vein. The patient was referred to neurosurgery in view of keratocavernous fistula. So it helps in diagnosis of urgent cases and further management. Now, role of imaging in neuropathic or complex strabismus. There is a role of dynamic imaging. We do a dynamic imaging where we study the cross-sectional area of the muscle in different gazes, and where the increase in cross-sectional area tells you the pathology. Like here in this case, in the dextro gaze, both the LR is contracting and there is increase in cross-sectional area of the muscle, which is showing synergistic divergence. And here in the levo gaze, inferior rectus is contracting in the levo gaze. So here we have published this paper describing this entity as synergistic innervational downshoot. And this even cis sequences shows hypoplastic third nerve. So dynamic imaging can help you localize the misinnervation problem in congenital cranial disinnervation disorder and help you plan the case appropriately so that the misinnervated muscle can be transposed accordingly to get better results. Now, consider this example, a case, 6-year-old girl presented with complaint of absent horizontal eye movement since birth. There was progressive scoliosis for the past 1 year. Now, imaging showed split pons sign, butterfly-shaped medulla, pons atrophy. So it was a consistent, MRI showed scoliosis. So it was neuroimaging confirmed the diagnosis of horizontal gaze palsy with progressive scoliosis. And this, the diagnosis helped in early rehabilitation of the child and proper counseling for the future pregnancies. Now, role of imaging in Pulley disorders. This 10-year-old boy presented with axial myopia of -20 diopters, and he presented with esotropia and hypotropia. There was limited abduction and elevation. And so the imaging of the muscle on of MRI orbit was done, and it revealed inferiorization of lateral rectus and medialization of superior rectus, thereby confirming the finding of myopic strabismus fixus, in which there is involutional change in the connective tissue band between the lateral rectus and superior rectus, where it could be elongated or ruptured. And this helps in knowing the pathology and planning accordingly, and loop myopexy can be done in such cases. Then role of muscle imaging. Again, this is a picture showing a female, 16-year-old female with large exotropia and adduction deficit. MRI orbit showed hypoplastic medial rectus, but when you do an axial scan, you see there is a absence of global fibers. So now you suspect that muscle could be absent intraoperatively, and that was the case here. We found it intraoperative, and things could be planned pre-hand. So it helps in early diagnosis, preoperative, early planning, prevent intraoperative surprise, and avoid complications, resulting in better outcomes. Then there is role of muscle imaging in strabismus with craniostosis. Now, syndromic craniostosis should often be imaged when it presents with large patterns or with duction deficit, because you might find absent muscle in such cases. Then there is a role of imaging in lost muscle, and you could very well localize the muscle, where is the muscle exactly located, so that you can pre-hand whether you will be able to retrieve the muscle or not. Now, strabismus with optic nerve pathology. Here is a case, 8-year-old boy presented with low vision exotropia and nystagmus. He had history of global developmental delay. So here it is showing exotropia with head posture, and there was a seesaw nystagmus, and there was a double ring sign on fundus. So neuroimaging showed bilateral optic nerve hypoplegia, absent septum pellucidum. So it was a consistent finding of septo-optic dysplasias, and it should be remembered that this diagnosis, optic nerve hypoplegia, can be related with CNS-related abnormalities, and misdiagnosis of septo-optic dysplasia may be life-threatening, especially in the presence of pituitary hormone abnormalities that can occur at any age, and it is important to recognize to avoid acute decompensation. And this patient was referred to pediatrics. Role of imaging in strabismus with developmental delay. Periventricular leukomalacia is often seen in premature children who often presents with strabismus. And in 2002, a study showed that strabismus and nystagmus can be only symptom presenting with periventricular leukomalacia. So the imaging findings can very well detect periventricular leukomalacia. In severe cases, it could be cystic encephalomalacia, passive ventriculomegaly, thin corpus callosum, even sometimes general matrix bleed. So this helps you in knowing the condition of the child, and the patient can be referred accordingly to the pediatrics, and physiotherapy and visual therapy can be started as soon as possible. Then role of imaging in strabismus with orbital pathologies. Now this year, 14-year-old female presented with acute diplopia on side gazes. And you could see here, there was a right eye abduction limitation and with narrowing of palpebral fissure, whereas there was widening of palpebral fissure along with adduction deficit in levoversion. So it was an inverse Duan sign. There was redness around the area of medial rectus. So we suspected the restrictive pathology, and imaging was done, and it revealed right eye medial rectus cysticercus, and the patient was managed accordingly. So imaging can also help in knowing the orbital pathologies like thyroid and other inflammatory disorders, orbital tumors, etc. The role of imaging in acute concomitant strabismus. There are various literature available which shows that acute onset esotropia can present with tumors, and one should know when to order a neuroimaging in case of acute onset esotropia. When there is absence of expected findings like hypermetropia, accommodative component in esotropia, older age, acute onset with diplopia with fusion potential, neurological sign, in the presence of atypical features or any other neurological signs at onset, and large esodiviation or recurrence. Consider this example, a 7-year-old female presented with acute onset ESO. There was not much difference with the small hypermetropia which she had. Fundus revealed papilledema on both eyes. So neuroimaging was ordered, and it showed perioptic nerve sheath distension and vertical tortuosity of optic nerve, which was consistent with the finding of BIH. So we tried finding out the cause of BIH, and it came out to be the craniosynostosis, as because of the abnormal shape of her skull, and it showed synostosis of sagittal and lambdoid suture along with the synostosis of metopic sutures. So she was further managed in pediatric departments. So know when to say no to imaging. You should know if a patient presents with diplopia with a prior history of any ophthalmic surgery. Like see this case. This patient presented with diplopia, acute onset diplopia in the dextro version. And if you could see, this patient had left eye adduction deficit in dextro version along with a narrowing of the palpebral fissure, and you could see there is narrowing and enophthalmos, whereas in dextro version, in the levo version, there is widening of the palpebral fissure. So we were suspecting a restrictive pathology. On asking history regarding any ophthalmic surgery, patient told that there was a pterygium surgery which happened 6 months back, and there was a fibrotic band on the lateral side which explained his condition. So here neuroimaging was not indicated. Now old traumatic third nerve palsy with aberrant regeneration need not imaging. Then history of long-standing stable strabismus. Then older patients with divergence paralysis, ESO, where patients present with small diplopia on the lateral sides, and this is because of the sagging eye syndrome, age-related. So to conclude, knowing when you should image and when you should hold back is important. Decision to choose to image a patient with strabismus can be life-saving decision. After a detailed history, a complete ophthalmic examination, a special attention to the pupillary examination, sensoromotor examination, and alignment in multiple gazes along with versions and ductions. Anatomy of cranial nerves is complex and its knowledge is crucial. It is important to recognize and anticipate the neurological findings, and imaging can give a clue. Imaging also can help you make a diagnosis, but it can also help you rule out other dangerous conditions in the differential and help lay out a surgical plan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shweta. That was an excellent presentation. It's a vast topic, and you touched on almost all aspects of neuroimaging. I think the audience has a lot to learn and a lot to take back home. We can just take a break there while we discuss in the last. We have some cases that we have to discuss, but I'll just touch upon OCT angio and how OCT angiography can be used to my screen just is frozen. Just 1 minute, please. So OCT angiography has caused a lot of buzz in the retina world, and it's the latest technique that we have. There are a lot of studies which have of late come up describing the role of OCT angio in strabismus and amblyopia. And I would just try to give a brief overview of that and whether a strabismologist needs to know OCT angio or not. OCT angiography, why are we talking about it? Because it's a non-invasive imaging technique. It gives a high resolution volumetric blood flow information of the retina, and at the same time we do not have to inject a dye. It is a non-invasive fast acquisition time machine, and it might be particularly helpful in children who will be obviously uncooperative for a fluorescein angiography. So this is how an OCTA scan looks like, where you can image the superficial and deep vascular plexus as well as the vascular plexus on the optic disc, and corroborate with the clinical findings on the fundus photo or on the OCT. A lot of studies came up which talked about the OCT angiography in strabismus and in amblyopia in particular. So giving a brief overview, there was a lot of information available suddenly, and all of the studies had contradictory results. But few conclusions that all these studies gave us was that in patients who have amblyopia, there is a decrease in macular vascular density of the superficial capillaries as well as the deep capillaries. You see this area, which is the foveal avascular zone, because the fovea is avascular. And the studies did notice an enlargement of this avascular zone, not only in the amblyopic eye, but in the contralateral fellow eye as well. The optic disc vascularity was also found decreased in the amblyopic eye compared to the contralateral eye. A meta-analysis of all the studies that have been done also reproduced that amblyopic eyes have lower vessel density as compared to the fellow eyes, and not in the deep capillary plexus. And regarding the foveal avascular zone, the studies had contradictory results. We did publish one of ours where we tried to look at OCT angio in amblyopia in 6 to 12-year age group. We recruited all kinds of amblyopia and also adjusted them for their axial length growths. We saw that the superficial and deep vasculature of the amblyopic eye is altered as compared to a normal child who does not have amblyopia, but the vasculature of the fellow eye of an amblyope was also altered. And interestingly, we also saw that the choriocapillaries of the normal eye and the amblyopic eye were different. You see, the normal eye has a pattern which is regular, and in the amblyopic eye, we saw these attenuated choriocapillaries in comparison to the fellow eye, and also the vessel density was reduced. So we concluded that the pathogenesis of amblyopia may involve the choriocapillaries with our study. Maybe they are the source of nutrition for the retina, and perhaps this is where we need to study more the pathogenesis of amblyopia. Few studies talked about pre-treatment and post-treatment differences also on OCTA, because we have documented a decrease in vascularity. One study said that it did not change, and one said that after patching, the vessel density seemed to increase. So this reversal also kind of was corroborating with the finding that maybe it is the pathogenesis of amblyopia involving the retina and the choroid. Again, we have just 2 studies and we still need larger number of patients to prove this point. So just overview of all these studies tells us that there is a reduced vascularization of the affected as well as the fellow eye. Both eyes are affected in amblyopia. So we, for studies, we might not be, we should not take actually the fellow eye of amblyopia to be normal. We cannot presume it to be normal. This vascularization defect, is it the cause of amblyopia or is it because amblyopia has led to this vascularization defect? We cannot establish that. There is one study which talks about reduced apoptosis in amblyopia, giving it a thicker fovea in the amblyopic eye. Again, not validated. OCTA parameters are helpful because they will help us in maybe establishing the vessel density in amblyopia, but we cannot use them as a surrogate for the neuronal maturity, that is the basis of pathogenesis in amblyopia. And the reversal of changes in OCTA, we need larger studies to actually prove that. There is no correlation in any of the studies between the severity of amblyopia, the type of amblyopia, and the vessel density, of course. Till then, in conclusion, I would just say that these vascular changes, which are seen on OCTA, they do not imply a causality of the amblyopia. They are not the cause of amblyopia. It is not clear whether these findings actually lead to amblyopia or amblyopia is causing these findings. At what stage we see them, it's still to be reproduced and validated. Till then, OCTA for strabismus and amblyopia, we can do it, but might not be able to use it that much clinically and for patient treatment. Thank you. So I think we are on time, and I would like to invite Dr. Jaspreet and Dr. Shweta for the next presentation now, which I have collected some cases just overviewing how we can use these imaging technologies that we have discussed for our clinical management of patients. And as a pediatric ophthalmologist, when do we use them? Why do we use them? So moving on, I go back to the first talk, the UBM and the ASOCT. I talked about a patient who had exotropia in the left eye, did not have any records, had almost full extraocular movements. And we tried to see which eye was operated upon. And we did see it on the ASOCT that in the right eye, the medial rectus and the lateral rectus was seen normally and measured normally. On the imaging the left eye medial rectus, we saw that the patient had a recessed medial rectus and could clearly seen on a colored scan as well. So we went ahead and we advanced the medial rectus and operated on the same eye. Of course, there is a palpebral fissure narrowing because this was the reoperated eye, but ASOCT helped us in at least making the diagnosis and then planning the surgery. Another case, a patient who was 22-year-old and had a history of left eye pterygium surgery and then presented with an exotropia. So normally in such cases, you look at the extraocular movements, you try to see whether there is something which has damaged the medial rectus. You'll try to see, maybe, ask the patient, vision is equal, get operated in the other eye. We just wanted to confirm what happened to the medial rectus during pterygium surgery, whether it was injured or not, because the motility is full. We saw that the medial rectus was absolutely normal and at the same place as it should be in a treatment naive patient. So we operated the same eye like a normal surgery. This exotropia was maybe incidentally related to the pterygium, and the patient did not have any motility deficit after we operated the left eye as well. Again, another patient, a 22-year-old female who had a left large XT 65 PD. We did have the records this time because the patient had undergone a squint surgery in the left eye in childhood, had a pseudo exotropia and a macular drag also, a little bit in addition to the true exotropia. So other eye surgery is obviously warranted and can be easily done, but a 65 PD, we were not expecting that the other eye would also, the surgery on the other eye would also not cause a axis to be parallel. So we tried to see what we had done previously and we tried to recapitulate. The left eye medial rectus, when we saw, you see this thin band and you see this hypoechoic area. By experience, we know that this continuous hypoechoic area is actually the medial rectus. It's actually the muscle, and this thin band does not look like a actual muscle. It's thin. It might be fibrotic. It might be a scar. Might be a pseudotendon, but it is continuous with the sclera. So we knew that this eye, medial rectus, did have some, we could do something about it. And so intraop also we saw this stretch scar, which was continuous with the muscle. And we plicated this muscle ultimately, and we got a fairly good outcome. Although we could not correct the whole amount, we did not expect to. We did not induce much additional motility deficit. And the patient was, fairly happy. And we can obviously plan the other eye surgery now, but we'll be more sure now. And this is not the operated eye, so it will help us. So I would like to just invite comments from Dr. Jasprit and Dr. Shweta as to, when you have a patient who has an additional, has undergone a surgery, do you like to, image, or do you like to stick to the intraop findings? Dr. Jasprit, please.
Those are interesting cases. I mean, these are obviously you don't get, patients sometimes they don't have their records available and come up maybe years later with all these issues. So yes, there are other ways. I mean, everybody obviously may not have access to your UBMs and ASOCTs. So it's not that you can't do without them. But yes, it's just like if you have imaging, if you have an MRI or something, you would like to get a image to corroborate your clinical findings. So no doubt it's helpful that way. But otherwise, clinical measurements are very important. You do your saccage, you do your pursuit, you see your limitation, you see your narrowing of fissures, you see your slit lamp examination, you have a conjunctival scarring or what is there. So these are different clues which can tell you, okay, yes, this patient has been operated previously, and what you expect of this patient. But just we have tools like this which are non-invasive, which are basically non-contact tools, and they could help you in identifying these things. No doubt these are good tools. But yes, morphology of the muscles is very important. Whether it's a thin muscle, a thick muscle. So all these things have to be taken into account. So it's a complete picture which has to be taken into account before going ahead with the surgery. Yes, you have to counsel the patient that yes, everything is not imaging. It's will be decided on table what's there. But those where you cannot do imaging, probably I think you could many would do the other eye as well, because it's like taking it as a new case. So imaging helps, no doubt, in planning your surgery, but definitely clinical evaluation has to be, you have to have you can say, a combination of clinical examination and imaging.
One thing I would also like to add on Dr. Savleen, UBM and OCT can be a very helpful modality if you're suspecting any muscle loss or any muscle absence, hypoplasia. And this could be a very useful tool in a patient coming and you are suspecting those kind of things.
Thank you. It's very good that you brought that point up, because of course, if you have the imaging technology, why not do it? It will just aid you.
Available, and it's a very cheap and confirming the same.
Yes, because if you are in an ophthalmology practice, you might have access to these machines and not to maybe the MRI and CT scan in the first go. And now that you have mentioned muscle, absent muscle, I would just like to share my next case with all of you.
Before that, just hold on. Yeah, so in those horizontal muscles, supposing you have a choice between UBM and ASOCT, what would you prefer? You won't be doing both of them. So what is you have both of them in the OPD. You have a 50 Hertz probe, you have wide angle UBM, and you have an ASOCT as well. So how would you like? And obviously everything has a charge to it. You do ASOCT, it costs to the patient. You do UBM, it costs to the patient. Now you have two modalities. What would you choose in these patients? Like, what is your experience in UBM versus the ASOCT in such patients?
If I have access to both and I have to answer, one, I would definitely say ASOCT, because ASOCT would obviously be more accurate, and there are more chances that I might pick up something on the ASOCT than on the UBM in an outpatient department. Under topical anesthesia, it'll be more comfortable. It'll be for charges for in a practice like where you have an ultrasound, I think it'll charge the same for the UBM. But one, if I have to choose, I would definitely choose ASOCT. In a very small child, which I know might not cooperate for an ASOCT, I would just in that case, that's the only indication to my mind where I would maybe take the child up for surgery and do a preoperative UBM just to confirm my findings. But of course, as you said, we have clinical cues as well. And if I have to choose one, ASOCT now, in my mind, should replace the UBM.
ASOCT, I mean, no doubt it's a non-contact tool. Just get the patient there. Even a child probably will help you. Whereas UBM, you have to you have to have a contact with the eye as well. But considering naive muscles versus those which have been operated, the UBM would probably give a better has a better penetration as compared to ASOCT versus, because what I mean, obviously we would require more on this, more studies, more patients on this. You have published one paper, I mean, which is coming in JPOS, so probably that would also have some answers. But is the penetration better of UBM as compared to ASOCT in operated muscles, where you have a lot of conjunctival scarring or maybe some kind of tissue growing around the muscles and fibrotic muscles? So how would in case, or is it like if you can't image the patient with ASOCT, you would take the patient for UBM? Would that be an option? And probably I think all these answers would come up in more and more. I mean, we are studying these cases, and yes, over a period of time, all these we would be having maybe you can say a fairly good evidence to show which is a better modality for imaging in operated muscles, where we actually want to know what's going on.
Sir, you're right. When you have a reoperated, you want to reoperate on a muscle, the penetration as such, the principle of UBM will give you a more penetration than ASOCT. It will be more superficial. You can't go beyond the iris. I mean, the principle is like that. You have more penetration with UBM, but the resolution of ASOCT is better. So if I have a big scar, you are right, you might not be able to reach the muscle with the ASOCT, but I would still do an ASOCT first because the resolution is more. The penetration is less, but the resolution of that area is more. It defines the scar better to whatever little experience that I have. And of course, we need more people to validate it and also to see, especially in cases of resurgeries, because they don't happen that much. You don't operate on the vertical muscles we have not explored. So we have to do larger studies. But yes, the pseudotendon and the scars that we see in a fairly clinically, if you can't see a scar on the limbus, and then you definitely do an ASOCT, it'll be better than UBM, because you have a large cyst there, and then those cases maybe the UBM would be better.
So image, I mean, it's these tools are helpful for your patients who've undergone previous surgery as well. And yes, an important point which Dr. Shweta pointed out probably will be evident in the next case as well. And yes.
Yes, so she talked about absent muscles and hypoplastic muscles. So I have a case where we had this 8-year male child presenting with a hypertropia in one eye. And we saw that there was a deficiency in depression. There was a large vertical tropia, had a large head tilt also since childhood. And we could see that there was an inferior oblique overaction and also an overaction of the superior rectus. And fundus also showed a large intorsion. He presented with a left head tilt. So hypertropia in one eye with deficient depression, with inferior oblique overaction. We were kind of thinking that what if the the inferior rectus is not there. The case that medial rectus aplasia Dr. Shweta showed, of course we have the MRI, but we thought we have the ASOCT now, so why not do the ASOCT and see. So this is the right eye of the patient. We try to see in all sectors where the inferior rectus should be, and try to go little medial and little lateral also. In all views we could not see. This is the right eye of the patient. At the same section, you don't see the muscle, and on the left eye, the same section you image on the ASOCT, and voila, you see the, the inferior rectus at the normal place. So just comparing the same area, you did had a suspicion for an abnormal muscle, and then you saw that the muscle was not even there. So it was an absent inferior rectus. On table also, we saw that this is the vortex vein, and where the normal inferior rectus should be, there was an episcleral vessel, which you find in cases of aplastic or absent muscles. We of course confirmed our findings on the neuroimaging. You see the left inferior rectus nicely seen, and the left side, the right side inferior rectus could not be seen from anterior to posterior scans. So ASOCT, in the next case that I see, maybe I would just do an ASOCT where I suspect a muscle aplasia or an absent muscle before I order an expensive and a more sophisticated imaging tool like the MRI. Of course, I have, earlier we used to have just the UBM. This is an older UBM picture. This patient also presented with trauma, and there was a large right hypertropia, and elevation and depression was like practically absent. So again, we were suspecting maybe, because of the trauma, inferior rectus is gone. And on the UBM, we saw that, okay, yes, the inferior rectus is there at 6 millimeters. So at least it's not the absent muscle. So we can obviously plan surgeries also according to that. So hypoplastic or absent muscles, Dr. Shweta has talked about neuroimaging. Dr. Shweta, now if you suspect a hypoplastic muscle, do you think you'll order MRI, or you would try to, try finding them on ASOCT or UBM?
Yeah, anterior segment OCT and UVM is a good modality if available at the center to confirm in the first go when the patient comes. But I guess, and going ahead with the operative straight away after UVM, I guess it could be done, but still I would like to confirm with the neuroimaging.
Yeah,
You're
so
right. Yeah, so please.
yeah, I mean, it's not a substitute for. That's what we want. That's what we want to tell also, that it's not a substitute. You could have the muscle posteriorly, and you might want to bring it anteriorly. So because UBM, ASOCT have the limits. Okay, so they just give a, probably we got a clue what it could be. Okay, so, and as rightly told by Sablin, that it's you compare it with the other eye as well. So it was a good indicator that probably you would be dealing with some kind of such sort of a pathology in the inferior rectus.
And normally, I mean, we were lucky that we could not find it. And sometimes what happens is the pathologies are more posterior. Sometimes, the posterior pathways, you have a limit of say 14, 15 mm. You can't see beyond that. So intraoperatively, more medial and more lateral, you are used to imaging the same place. So it's that's the word that I think I would also use, not a substitute at all, but that will just add on to what neuroimaging would actually tell us. It will just tell us that we are likely to find it on the neuroimaging.
And the other thing, neuroimaging is very important. Yeah, like I mean, like the talk which was given just now. I mean, neuroimaging is it's very important. When would you neuroimage a patient with diplopia? So basically, if you have a 6-nerve palsy, maybe a 50-year-old who's you can say hypertensive but does not have diabetes, and presents to you, you find okay, everything is going well, let's wait and watch. So when would you order imaging? Maybe after a couple of days, immediately, or maybe after a few months? Dr. Shweta?
Yeah, a patient presenting with more than 50-year-old patient presenting with mononeuropathy like 6-nerve palsy, and he is diabetic, hypertensive, then I would like to wait. It's not necessary, because literature also have shown a prospective study has been done, and they have imaged all the patients of mononeuropathies with and without vasculopathic risk factors, and they have found that the patients who were with vasculopathic factors, normally the cause was ischemia. So it's not necessary to image them, but yeah, if there is multiple cranial nerve neuropathy, if there is other neurological sign, or if the patient is progressing further, then you do need to image.
And what about these patients who don't have risk factors, like no diabetes, no hypertension? So you have a 50-year-old who presents with this thing.
Yeah,
And,
then you would like, then I would like to image.
you would like to image.
Yeah, look, what is the positive factor?
Yeah, or you would order the blood investigations first and then see and then image. How is it
Yeah, I
like?
would like to do the blood investigations, rule out the systemic findings of diabetes, hypertension, do a BP charting, and then if he doesn't have any after ruling out the vasculopathic risk factors, then I would like to image the patient.
And what about this these criteria in children? Like supposing a child comes with 6-nerve palsy and
In a child, the literature says that you should image every child with any kind of mononeuropathy, because there could be a hiding neoplastic etiology, and so they should be imaged.
so at first instance, would you image, or you would see some kind of like post-vaccination or post-viral fever the patient had, or wait for maybe a week or 10 days or 2 weeks or before imaging? Because imaging for a child would be, obviously you have to see the MRI, you have to give the child GA or maybe sedate before the child goes into that tunnel, which is quite is an experience. So how is it like? So would you wait or would you immediately order in a child?
A case post-vaccination 6-nerve palsy, again, I would like to image the patient. Even I mean, not immediately, but yeah, you can wait for a day or two and then see the whole picture. Come up with other findings. A pediatric examination is a must, and then we can go ahead. If we find nothing, then maybe there is a hiding tumor or something else, or even sometimes raised ICT, which can be present in a child. So because we have seen certain craniostosis children also presenting with 6-nerve palsy with raised ICT. So I would like to image a child, taking down the history. A pediatric examination will do them.
Yeah, so I mean, so it's obviously ominous sign in children when you have these kind of nerve pulses which are not there. But yes, you rightly said. I mean, you have to take the history of the child, how, where, and how, when did it start, how is it, and in my experience, like obviously they are not very common, the pediatric cranial nerve palsies, but yes, in maybe a few children, we have had the success of treating them with steroids. So considering them maybe some kind of a viral or something or a inflammatory thing which responded to steroids, and on follow-up over months and years, probably they are stable now, and we could avoid neuroimaging. But yes, it's very important. You can't take a chance in children as well. You have to keep your you have to be very careful about these dangerous signs which are there in neuroimaging the children.
Before doing neuroimaging, fundus examination is a very must thing, and we should do it before ordering a neuroimaging.
Yeah, and slow-growing tumors are very common in children. I mean, 6-nerve palsy from slow-growing tumors. I mean, you could even miss those. So it's very important that children are dealt in not the same way as adults. I mean, they're different. You have to see what etiologies they have, and accordingly manage them, taking care that obviously they are under a pediatrician's guidance as well, follow-up. Because that's very important. We might be able to diagnose things, but ultimately the management may be by a pediatrician or so it's a combined approach, which is very important in dealing with the children when you present with such kind of pathologies.
Thank you, Dr. Jaspreet. Just recapitulating, the take-home messages that in children our threshold for imaging would be lower, and we would like to image them, not treat them like adults, and neuroimage maybe a little earlier. And I always like to take the history. You have to be, if it is a very sure history of an acquired onset palsy, you have to image in the first go. Just stressing on what we've already said, since we're just winding up. This again, as a case of a 5-year male who presented, was referred actually as a case of monocular elevation deficit in the left eye. So if you see carefully, we see a proptosis in the eye, and we also see there are lid fissure changes. So we have to image in the first go. We cannot wait for this to go away. And we saw that the patient actually had an optic nerve glioma presenting with strabismus and no other features. The child, of course, will not say that the child has low vision. Again, a case of abnormal movements. This was passed on as normal. Even when I saw the child, I was like, there's nothing wrong with this child. But the mother kept on saying that the left eye is abnormal, the left eye is abnormal. And once you closely see that, yes, of course, you see this upbeating nystagmus in the left eye, and the right eye is not showing any abnormality. You see this left upward jerk in the eye, and on the other side, at the same time, the right eye is not showing. So the child did have nystagmus. The child also had, a head bobbing and a torticollis. So I always like to trust the mother, and normal eye movements in a child. Again, image in the first go, this child was having spasm mutans and MRI was normal. So for when would I order it in the first visit? If I have a systemic complaint, a systemic sign, neuroimaging in the first visit. Have any associated changes along with strabismus like lid changes or globe displacement, order in the first visit. You have new onset movement disturbances. You have pictures which was normal one day and 6-nerve palsy on the other day. Of course, I order, and not without a thorough ophthalmic examination. We have discussed this, and we did publish in adults a protocol. We tried to see some patients of diplopia presenting to a center. Of course, there's a referral bias because we are sitting in a tertiary care center, and we saw more patients presenting with more sinister pathologies. But we gave this protocol. If you all are interested, then just go through this protocol of imaging in adults, how isolated palsies can, presumed ischemic causes, sometimes investigated ischemic causes can wait, and how multiple palsies and how other presentations and other signs which are sequential, they are not resolving or progressing, you do need to image them in the when you see them. So we have discussed, we have a lot of imaging modalities available with us. We haven't touched on to all imaging modalities, but we did try to cover some where the strabismologist can, make use of these. When planning a resurgery, we have established if you have the tools like ASOST and UBM, you do use them. UBM is a contact method, so ASOST might be better in identification. For neuroimaging, you have to do a thoughtful testing because you don't want to waste resources. It obviously has cost constraints, and you cannot order a neuroimaging unnecessarily. So your indications should be very clear. You should use the most sophisticated instrument or tool available, but not without a thorough clinical examination. So I think I would like to end by acknowledging Dr. Jasprit, who has been the guiding force behind everything that I've been doing, the residents, the staff of Advanced Eye Center. Thank you very much. And one final comment from Dr. Jasprit and Dr. Shweta, please.
So, I mean, this is something which people should explore, imaging. It's a very handy tool. And as you have discussed in this webinar and all, I mean, whenever you have maybe doubts, imaging could help you and help you in planning maybe a way out for the surgery. And for all these patients who require a resurgery, probably if you have these convenient tools, you should go ahead with them.
Dr. Shweta, one final.
I would like to conclude saying that decision to make decision to order a neuroimaging is very important. So you should know when you should order and when you should not. So it should know the anatomy of the cranial nerves and related related part of the MRI, and it is important to recognize and anticipate the neurological findings. And imaging can give you a very good clue and can help you in diagnosing the case as well as in the management.
Thank you. So for the young attendees, anatomy is what you should know before you order neuroimaging, and not order them unnecessarily. Of course, they will help you more if you have made a clinical diagnosis, you have something in mind, and then you use these tools to just confirm your diagnosis. That would be the best. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Jasprit, for the guidance on this course. And thank you, Dr. Shweta, for joining. I know it was last moment for you. So thank you so much for being a part of this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for this wonderful imaging webinar. It was a pleasure. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Shweta, also.
Thank you, Dr.
The good overview. I mean, very well summarized. And yes, the idea behind this, all this webinar was Dr. Savleen. So all credit to you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Padam. I think we finished on time.
And also appreciate everyone to finishing the presentation before time. Thank you so much for that.
Okay.
And also it was a wonderful session.
Thank you. Thank you so much.